Alrighty, so here are talk-through reviews of the path and components of cranial nerves 9 and 10, so glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves.
Okay, so we're going to go through the glossopharyngeal nerve, that's cranial nerve 9, and it has all the components you can really think of for a nerve, and they branch off at different points, but it kind of looks like there's 4 main little branches coming off, and then the whole nerve descends and terminates in a couple places. So let's start at the beginning. The whole nerve goes through the jugular foramen. Just before the jugular foramen, there's the superior ganglion of cranial nerve 9, and that is a sensory ganglion that is composed of somatic sensory fibers or cell bodies. So that's just a sensory ganglion. Superior ganglion's got the somatic ones in there. Then underneath the jugular foramen, right when it comes through it, you have the inferior ganglion of cranial nerve 9. That's also a sensory ganglion. So right around the jugular foramen, there's 2 sensory ganglions, superior and inferior. The inferior has the sensory cell bodies of taste and visceral sensory. So you have somatic on top, then visceral and taste sensation underneath. The first thing that happens once it goes through the jugular foramen is you have a branch off called the tympanic nerve, and that travels up through the tympanic canaliculus and comes out the other side. And what is making up that tympanic nerve is visceral motor and visceral sensory. So this is just completely visceral. This is completely not somatic. The first thing that gets rid of after it goes through the tympanic canaliculus is the visceral sensory. It plexiforms and creates the tympanic plexus right outside the tympanic canaliculus. Now that nerve continues. What was the tympanic nerve is continuing just as visceral motor as the lesser / superficial petrosal nerve. So you've seen the greater petrosal nerve, and that is a part of the facial nerve, but now we're going and you have the lesser petrosal nerve. That is going to go through the foramen ovale, and then it's going to synapse in the otic ganglion. So you have those preganglionic parasympathetic fibers synapsing, now they're postganglionic parasympathetic on the other side of that foramen ovale and the otic ganglion, and those fibers are going to the parotid gland, and that's the termination of that first branch. So the first branch was that tympanic nerve, goes through tympanic canaliculus. The tympanic plexus happens with the visceral sensory, and then the visceral motor continues through the foramen ovale as the lesser petrosal nerve synapses in the otic ganglion and goes to the parotid gland. So next, right about that same level, you have a somatic sensory branch coming off of the main cranial nerve called the auricular nerve branch. And that goes and provides the somatic sensation of the auricular branches. So those are 2 of the branches. Now the nerve continues down a little bit, and then it's going to give off the carotid sinus nerve. And that is completely visceral sensory, and that's going to provide sensation at the carotid bifurcation to both the body and the sinus for the carotid. So now you have 3 branches coming off. You first had the tympanic nerve, then the auricular nerve, now the carotid sinus nerve. Then as the cranial nerve 9, that main branch continues down, it's going to give off a branchiomotor branch to the stylopharyngeus. And it just goes straight to that muscle and innervates it. Now that cranial nerve 9, you've gotten all 4 of those branches off of it. It keeps descending further, and all that's left is taste and visceral sensory. And so it's going to end by having the visceral sensory creating the pharyngeal plexus, which is general sensation to the pharyngeal mucosa. And then you have some more of that visceral sensory as well as taste branching off and going to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. And it's providing that general sensation and taste. And that is the very bottom of that nerve. And that's the whole thing. Okay, so here comes cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve. It's also got all the components that a nerve could have, and the whole thing is going to go through the jugular foramen, just like the glossopharyngeal nerve. Right before that jugular foramen, there is also just like with the glossopharyngeal, there is a superior ganglion, but this time of cranial nerve 10. Similarly, it is just sensory, and it's somatic sensory at the top, same as the other. Then underneath, after the jugular foramen, you have the inferior ganglion of cranial nerve 10, which is also, just like glossopharyngeal, the sensory taste and the visceral sensory. So you go through that jugular foramen as the whole nerve, and the first thing that happens is a recurrent meningeal branch comes off and then goes back up through the jugular foramen, like an instantaneous going back up through it, as well as an auricular branch that doesn't go back up through it, but it just comes right off right after and below the jugular foramen. And those are both somatic sensory. So the first two branches are somatic sensory. The recurrent meningeal is going back up through the jugular. The auricular branch just came off right after the jugular and just goes off there. So then, like I said, you hit that inferior ganglion of cranial nerve 10, the sensory ganglion. And then as the vagus nerve goes down, you're going to give off these branches. So the first thing that's going to come off is the pharyngeal branches. And those are going to have branchiomotor, visceral sensory, and taste. And those are the first branches. They're all pharyngeal branches. Then you go down and you have the superior laryngeal nerve coming off. And that is going to provide both branchiomotor via an external laryngeal branch, which goes to the cricothyroid, as well as an internal laryngeal branch, which is just visceral sensory, and it's providing sensation to the laryngeal mucosa superior to the vocal folds. So that branch that comes off after the pharyngeal branches is called the superior laryngeal nerve, which then turns into both the internal and external laryngeal branch. External is that motor one to the cricothyroid. Internal is the sensation to the laryngeal mucosa. So now you've given off the pharyngeal and the superior laryngeal nerve. Somewhere between that, it could be connected to one or the other, is a carotid sinus nerve. And it is just visceral sensory, similar to the glossopharyngeal, except for this one only innervates the carotid body, which is ridiculous because it's called the carotid sinus nerve and it innervates the carotid body, so that's messed up. But I digress. So you have the first two branches, pharyngeal, laryngeal, and then that carotid sinus makes 3. Then you go down further and you have the recurrent laryngeal nerves. So, you have the recurrent laryngeal nerves that then, as they course, change names to inferior laryngeal nerve, which makes sense because it's underneath the superior laryngeal nerve I mentioned. But it starts out as recurrent laryngeal nerve, becomes inferior laryngeal nerve, and then it branches off to go to the laryngeal, pharyngeal, and esophageal muscles and the mucous membrane. So similar to the nerve above it, it is just branchiomotor and visceral sensory. Except for this time, the visceral sensory goes to the laryngeal mucosa inferior to the vocal cords, whereas that sensory in the superior laryngeal nerve right above that one went to the superior mucosa, to the vocal folds, the laryngeal mucosa. So then those are basically the main branches off of the vagus nerve. So to recap that, we had the recurrent meningeal branch going back up and through, auricular branch going off, and those are both the somatic sensory. We go down past the inferior ganglion. We have first the pharyngeal branches coming off. Then we have the superior laryngeal nerve, which goes external and internal branches. Then we have the carotid sinus nerve somewhere between those. And then we have the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which becomes the inferior laryngeal nerve. So then finally, we have some more somatic sensory as well as these visceral motor that have not synapsed anywhere going all the way down. And this is the cranial nerve 10 continues all the way down into the thoracic and abdominal world because you have a cardiac and pulmonary ganglion that the parasympathetic preganglionic is going to synapse and go to the thoracic viscera along with some visceral sensory. And then you're going to have the same thing happen, but it's going to be an enteric ganglion, and you're going to have those postganglionic as well as the somatic sensory going, or the visceral sensory going and innervating the abdominal viscera. and that's the termination of cranial nerve 10.